Now, I'm going to tell you something very important, so you have to listen up very carefully. When you're strengthening an argument and weakening it, but let's just talk about strengthening for now. When you're strengthening an argument, the option that's the best to reinforce that point being made isn't the option that sounds the strongest or the one that uses the most serious or high modality language. It's actually the option that is the most relevant and specific to the point being made. Right, please listen to those two keywords being used. The answer has to be relevant and specific to the argument. If it's not, then it actually doesn't really help the argument at all, right? You can imagine it like this. Even if an argument talks about why, let's say, for example, plastic bags are bad for the economy, meaning money, financial, it doesn't matter if one of the options says something super serious and super emotional, such as, oh, plastic bags are going to destroy the Amazon rainforest, or plastic bags are killing millions of sea life each year. I know it sounds really serious, but that option isn't that relevant and it's really not that specific to the point the author's trying to make. Right? The author's trying to say it's bad for the economy, money wise, right? Bringing in the environment and bringing in the animals and talking about the ecosystem is sort of going off topic. And if you go off topic, then guess what? You're not really helping the author argue their point anymore. It's more like you're trying to hijack the author's argument and take it in your own direction. And that is definitely not strengthening the argument. If you want to strengthen the argument, pick the option that reinforces why it's bad for the economy. For example, if an option says, oh, plastic bags are a big waste of money, that's going to be the answer. Even though it might not look as powerful as plastic bags are killing millions of sea life each year, it's the one that's more specific and it's actually the one that's more relevant to the point being made. And your job here is not to start your own argument and it's not to be this great debater. Your job here is to simply support the author's point. Whatever the author is trying to argue, you are simply there to push it forward and help support it. It's not your job to dictate which way the argument's going to go, and it's definitely not your role to change the topic of the argument just because you think it'll be better if they argue it that way. So, repeating myself again, if you want to pick the best option, look for the one that's most relevant and specific to the argument. And you can do that by having a look at which option actually follows the same keywords as the ones used in the argument, right? Because if the argument uses the keywords money, financial, and economy, then look for the option that mentions those key ideas of money, right? For example, the option that mentions that it's a big waste of money, right? That's going to follow the same ideas. If another option mentions environment or mentions pollution, well, that's not really relevant to the keywords used in the argument, right? Because the argument uses the keywords money. This option uses the keywords environment and pollution. Those two don't go together. Right? I know it might sound like, oh, just ignore your own instincts, but this is thinking skills. You're not really supposed to go in with your previous knowledge and you're not supposed to go in with your previous bias. You are meant to be very logical and you're meant to be thinking very critically. Whatever the author is trying to argue, you are arguing that same idea too. Go back and have a look at all the questions you've done before, right? From tutoring centers or from exercise books or from past papers and sample papers. Have a look at the answer. And I'll know and I'm confident you'll see that the option that's the best at strengthening or weakening is the one that follows the same key ideas as the ones that are mentioned in the argument. Right? If you look at it, they'll probably use the same keywords or key phrases, or at least follow the same direction and idea as the author. Now, when it comes to argument questions, it is actually quite repetitive, not only just the passage, but the options too. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you have a look at the sample papers and the past papers, you would realize that the options in strengthening and weakening argument questions usually follow a very generic formula, right? When the question writer are writing the options A, B, C, D, the options usually come in one of these four types. Right? The first type of option is going to be, obviously, there's going to be the correct option. Now, the correct option is usually the most relevant, right? That's the main characteristic that the correct option is going to have towards the argument. Now, the second type of option is going to be the one that does what the question asks, but is not as relevant or is not as specific. Right? So they're the option that also strengthens the argument, or also weakens the argument, but they have a simple flaw in them. Either they don't mention a keyword that was mentioned in the passage, or they go off topic a little bit. Whatever it is, there is something off about that option that just makes it not as targeted and as specific to the argument than the correct option is. Now, the third type of option you'll see is the neutral option. The neutral option is going to be the option that basically doesn't really fight for or against the argument, right? Whatever it says, it doesn't really add anything to the argument at all, right? It could be just a very plain statement that doesn't really have too much of an opinion. And the fourth type of option that I'm sure you've all seen before is the option that does the opposite of what the question asks. Now, that's going to be the easiest option to eliminate. Basically, if the question is asking to strengthen, there's an option that's going to weaken the argument. If the question asks to weaken, there's going to be an option that strengthens the argument, right? And question writers put that option there just to allow students to kind of help eliminate an option very quickly and narrow it down to just three things, right? So at every level, it's going to be harder and harder to eliminate, right? It's very easy to eliminate the option that does the opposite. It's relatively easy to eliminate the option that's neutral, right? Because if you read it and you understand what it says, you actually realize that it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't really go for, or it doesn't really take an against stance towards the argument. Now, the hardest one is going to be the option that also strengthens or weakens, but is just not as relevant and not as specific. And that's the whole point of this exercise, right? The whole point of this masterclass is really helping you narrow down how to identify the correct option versus the second best one. Now, let's give some questions a go. I've pulled out 4 questions from the sample paper and from past papers, and we're going to use them as examples to prove how to identify a conclusion and how to find the most relevant and most specific option that strengthens that conclusion and those points being made. So, first question, let's give this a go. So, let's give our first question a go. So, the first question is, Sanjay said that wind farms will not meet all our energy needs as the demand for electricity grows because we cannot rely on a source that varies with the weather. We need power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which is why the construction of wind turbines with the uneven output is not the solution. All right, so this question, which one of these statements, if true, most strengthens Sanjay's argument? First of all, before we even look at the options, right, we should never jump straight to the options until we understand what the argument is saying, right, and what's the main point, and if any assumptions and mistakes were made in between. Now, I don't really see any major assumptions in this argument, so what is the main point? Well, the main point is Sanjay here Sanjay doesn't like wind farms, right? I think we can all clearly understand that. But what is his problem with the wind farm, right? So we got to be a bit more specific. We can't just say wind farms are bad or Sanjay thinks wind farms are bad, because I don't think he just believes they're a bad thing. His problem is that wind farms are flawed, right? So they're flawed in which way? In terms of producing electricity. So I'm sure he thinks that wind farms are good for the environment, but he seems to have a problem with its ability to produce electricity. So let's condense it down. Sanjay's main point is that wind farms are flawed producers of electricity. Right? That's his main point. So, if we're trying to strengthen his argument, we want to find an option that basically reinforces the idea that wind farms are flawed producers of electricity. So, let's look for an option which provides new evidence on why these wind farms have problems when it comes to making electricity. Option A says scientists have found that global average wind speeds are increasing. If wind speeds are increasing, that would be good for wind farms because that just means wind farms have more power. So option A, that's the option that does the opposite of what the question asks. So option A, definitely we can eliminate it because that is only weakening Sanjay's argument by saying that wind farms are a good idea. Option B, there is no practical way to store the energy generated by wind turbines. That sounds really good, right? Because that's providing a new evidence statement on another flaw, another problem that wind farms have in terms of producing electricity, right? So Sanjay's already said that they don't really produce enough electricity. And not only that, option B adds that even if they do produce electricity, we can't even store this electricity. That sounds like a very good option to me. Let's just see if there's anything even better. Option C, local residents often complain about wind turbines spoiling the landscape. I mean, sure, it is saying something bad about wind farms, but it has nothing to do with electricity, right? It's not really relevant to Sanjay's argument. And option D, a single wind turbine can generate the same energy as 1,000 solar panels. Okay, definitely not option D. Option D is weakening Sanjay's argument by saying really good things about wind farms. So, in this case, the answer here is going to be option B. That's really the only option that reinforces why wind farms are flawed when it comes to producing electricity. Let's give the second question a go. Right. In this second question, An's mother has written a letter to the school. She has suggested that for the children's safety, cars should be banned from the roads around the school at the beginning and at the end of the day, as there is a high risk of a child being involved in an accident.